Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Grow Your Path to Wellness. If this is your first time listening, my colleague Amanda and I, we host a wellness guest every week, and our new episodes release on Sundays. So be sure to subscribe and follow us so you don't miss out on anything new. Last week was Amanda was out caring for herself, but I hosted Lauren Kreidler, and we talked about many things, all things therapy. So some alternative methods for delivering therapy, the overall stigma tied to seeking out therapy, and then the overall impact of social media and breaking through the stigma of therapy. So if you missed that, make sure you go back. She touched on both of us touched on some unique perspectives and different ways of receiving therapy that are quote unquote unconventional or perceived that way, but are actually super effective for us. So this week, Amanda is back, and we welcome Chris Leonard to join us in exploring the disease of addiction. So welcome, Chris. We're super excited to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Chris Leonard. I have been in the addictions field since 2015. I have worked with many people struggling with addiction, and over the course of time, have just seen that the way we address addiction does not seem to match up with the disease model of addiction. I kind of want to just start off with, when we look at the disease model, we look at a long-term illness, a long-term disease. Mm-hmm. But how do we treat it?
Chris, can you talk more on, we look at it as a disease, because I think a lot of, especially laypersons in society, don't necessarily know that or don't understand what that means, because when you see the face of addiction, when you see it play out in real life, it doesn't necessarily match up with what they might know as heart disease.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the face of addiction is indiscriminate. It could be anyone, anywhere. It doesn't care about socioeconomic status, class. It doesn't matter of any of that. But as a disease, there really isn't a cure per se. We can only arrest these symptoms and monitor those symptoms if they were to come back. Somebody with heart disease may not be showing symptoms, but they're still going to their doctor for ongoing medical management to see if those symptoms come back. Whereas in addiction, most addiction programs, and this isn't intended to be a downside, but most addiction programs tend to be short term. You're there for 3 to 6 months or shorter, and then there's no ongoing care.
Yeah, and we have gotten on our soapbox many times on this podcast in the past, and it's my favorite soapbox to be on. Oftentimes that's not because the need isn't there, the medical necessity isn't there. It's oftentimes insurance dictated or financially dictated that someone's treatment is cut short.
And I would agree with that. And I would also even say it's part of the stigma of addiction. The idea of, well, if you just stop using, everything will be fine. I just kind of scratch my head at that, because we have to kind of even go below that. Why is the use even there? What purpose did it serve?
I was going to say that, Chris. That was going to be my jumping in point. Was very rarely, and I don't primarily specialize in working with addiction, but we know that dual diagnosis, and that I've never met somebody I can only speak from my experience, but somebody that has struggled with addiction, the disease of addiction, and also not experienced trauma. No,
absolutely.
Things that we are, like you said, that use is serving a functional, the brain is feeling the body, and to them it's like the only thing that they know to get some kind of need met, or to feel less discomfort or whatever it is for that person. So in our bullet points, I seen that acceptance of why addiction forms for people and the role that it started serving for them.
Absolutely. And, we tend to arbitrarily dictate which addictions are acceptable and which ones aren't. But as I want to kind of go back to your mental health point and trauma, for those who are just listening in, I'm making a fist with a hand over the fist. If the fist is your mental health and it's not in a healthy space, we're struggling with it, we feel isolated, we feel this pain, it is being covered with this substance use. That's how it's being coped with. But if we just remove the substance use and we don't start targeting what's underneath, we have all of this unchecked mental health. And once the symptoms of it start reappearing, so does the addiction.
Yeah, and that doesn't even have to be quote unquote mental illness. That doesn't have to be to the point where it's, at the point of being pathology. It's just, as children, were you given the emotional regulation skills you needed to deal with those heavy emotions? And I see that all the time in my clients, is that, like you said, there's like this hierarchy almost of what's acceptable as an addiction, right? So like workaholism, people that are working all the time, that sort of addiction is actually encouraged in our society, hustle culture, and get it done and produce. But you stick a needle in your arm and now you're, seen by some as scum of the earth or whatnot, but, or alcohol, right? Like people go to the bars, that's socially acceptable. You can legally buy it. But yeah, there's like this hierarchy to what's acceptable as far as helping regulate your emotions, but nobody looks at what's underneath.
And I can only speak from my own experience. There are two things I tend to tell individuals that I work with kind of right out the gate. One, addiction doesn't care about the word legal. Legality is a word that has no place in addiction. Just because something is legal does not mean, nicotine, alcohol, as you mentioned, follows the same pathology. Sure, it may take longer to have certain repercussions, but it's being used for the same function. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna, it goes along, I feel like, with that acknowledgement piece of, we're only gonna acknowledge, like, it's kind of a parrot thing for me to say, but I hear that term functioning, of a functioning alcoholic or a functioning, addict. And I feel like I primarily hear that for alcoholism, but it's like in our society, well, I hear it from just the population of those that I have had experience working with an addiction, that I'm only going to acknowledge that it's a problem if it gets to this level or this point or this type of use, or, has this certain impact on me. Then we acknowledge it as addiction.
Absolutely. And kind of coming back to the second thing that I tell individuals I work with, I ask them right at the moment presenting issue. I go, what did it do for you? Which tends to sometimes takes people aback, like, wait, what? But no, I'm like, obviously it's doing something. I want to know what. Let's work through this. And I know I'm scrolling a little bit, but we made a comment about certain addictions being preferred almost. Workaholism. I like to kind of reflect off Gabor Mate when he talks about his addiction to work and the consequences it caused him.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's an interesting acceptance that we put on certain things versus others. I mean, think about how many people go to the gas station every single day and buy a lottery ticket or buy scratch offs, right? Like those sort of, there's an, and then I hear people say like, everyone has to have their vice, but like, okay, but do you? Because if someone gave you those skills a long time ago, maybe that wouldn't be the case, It's just an interesting perspective to think about.
Like I'm thinking that same thing, and my brain circled back around to what you said, Chris, of what role is this serving? Like is the primary thing, and looking at it as a vice. I have things in my life that I love to do and I enjoy, but it brings me joy. It's not bringing, the purpose looks a little bit different, I think, of what purpose is this serving you, or what is this, thing or substance or activity, what's that purpose serving for you? And I love that you asked them that, like, right up front in your work, because I could see how it would catch somebody off guard, but it would make them think of it probably a lot different if maybe it's accepted in our society to be doing whatever that is excessively, or or it's something that's stigmatized and they just don't go underneath of it and find out what it is, what purpose it's serving them.
And you hit on exactly what I was going to say next, that the idea of addiction just being met with this wall of shame, guilt, and fear to even talk about. So just asking, what did it serve for? What did it do for you? I'm not here to look at it in the realms of right or wrong, good or bad, whatever the moral compass is. I want to know what it's doing for you. Because if we don't understand what it's doing for you, kind of that underlying root of why this behavior is even happening.
Yeah, then we can't find alternatives and really work on the root. And I also was going to say, as far as like you asking them at the beginning, oftentimes people don't know because they are so in the throes of their addiction that it's now at the point of disease, right? So at that point, they're just using to not get sick, or they're using because they actually can't stop, right? Physically can't stop, emotionally can't stop. But so for sometimes it takes for some people, it can take a little time of getting through that post-acute withdrawal period, which can be up to 2 years, which I don't think general society understands. And again, there's the stigma piece of, once somebody gets sober, it doesn't just mean now they have a clean slate and they're good and they now are a terrible human if they pick up again. Post-acute withdrawal is real, and it's from everything from marijuana to alcohol to heroin. And for some of the more chronic users, and more quote unquote severe substances, right, with the more worse consequences, with continued use, those can be up to 2 years to have those symptoms go away. And those are both physical and mental. So I think I don't know how I rambled and got to that point, but I like that I did, because I think a lot of people don't know what post-acute withdrawal is. And I still educate my clients. If I say, like, did you know that marijuana actually has withdrawal symptoms? They'll be like, what?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. That's probably why you're feeling irritable. That's probably why you're getting in more arguments with your partner. That's probably why, you're not eating as much and you don't have as much of an appetite.
And I love that you actually went there with that, because in the substance may have different withdrawal symptoms, but there's withdrawal nonetheless. Even something that maybe just anyone could relate with, caffeine. I have my coffee, I won't lie. However, have you ever noticed how you feel when you don't have caffeine for an extended period of time if you drink it regularly? As Kelsi has her coffee, I love it.
Kelsi makes me jealous with her beautiful little clear mug she has there.
Well, but I feel like the garbage. Like, if I find myself even getting to like midday or something, if I didn't have a chance to make coffee that morning or something, and then I'm doing something and then I can start to feel those symptoms. Like, for me, like, I'm sure can be, similar for everybody with the caffeine, but the headaches, and I notice myself being more irritable, maybe a little bit more like lethargic and things. Absolutely.
Anything we're regularly being exposed to, I would say, not even like, it's not necessarily I'm addicted to my caffeine or coffee, but think about in Ohio in the wintertime when there's vitamin D depletion because we don't have as much sunshine and warmth, right? Those kind of things can impact your mood and mental health too. So I think it just can give a little more perspective and grace to someone to see, like, if that's not there, it's not a moral failure. Can you talk, Chris, before we go on? I know Kelsi's going to talk about the next point with you about social recovery, but obviously in society, like general society, there's an issue with treating it as a disease despite we know it's a disease, and that moral failure or shame part of it. Do you also see that play out in the professional world, like the treatment systems? And I don't know if that makes sense. Like, do you see that discrepancy between we know it's a disease, but you don't necessarily get treated that way, even in the place where you're supposed to be getting treated that way?
To a degree, yes, unfortunately. And that's, I don't want to say that's implicitly kind of the message, like that's what they're wanting to project. However, I have seen organizations stick to a very strict curriculum, and that curriculum tends to be short term. And then without wraparound services, without any type of ongoing monitoring, without evaluation, we just kind of go, okay, well, hope everything's good. We'll see you later. And so if that person's, let's say their underlying fear is fear of abandonment or emotional attachment, it almost plays right into it. This is a short-term thing that's going to help you. Then you're going to be on your own again.
I feel like that, and again, this isn't a whole soapbox about that. We've gotten on many times about, how funding is done and things and the role of insurances and all of that. So that's a factor. We know that, how, programs are able to be ran, and it's not an effective system. But then, like you said, exactly where my brain, that's why I had like that reaction that I did. I was like, they get this feeling right up front. And it's like, this is, and then I feel like too, the expectations of some of the programs, I feel like aren't conducive for a disease model. I feel like it makes them feel like these character or inherent flaws of their, like, if they have a relapse, then, you could get kicked out of this program, or, so many different stipulations or expectations that I think can implicitly or borderline there of also instilling that stigma.
And I would challenge you back with the question, why would you punish somebody for showing symptoms of the disease?
I was just going to say, Kelsi, like, that's what, I'm glad that you touched on that, because that's what I was going to say. Like, if somebody's getting chemo and radiation because they have cancer, but their cancer's still growing, you're not going to be like, yeah, you know what? We're going to kick you out of the chemo and radiation because you're just not trying hard enough. Sorry.
Right, and they're like, what do you mean? Like, I've seen that, like, where, some other places where I'd worked in the past, like those larger, like those programs, and they're great, but like you said, Chris, they're not long-term, or they don't have the essential meeting things in place for, after that acute, or stabilization phase of things. And then it's like, well, if X, Y, and Z happens, then you got to go. And they're like, wait, what?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's such like a glaring distinction for people. And if you say it in that way, like with another medical condition, it's like, oh, wow. But like the thing that people don't understand is addiction is a disease of the brain. So like, of course it's going to hijack all of your brain systems, like your thinking and your logic and your impulse control. Whereas if you have pancreatic cancer, unless it spreads, God forbid, but it's affecting your pancreas, right? And so you're not going to see all of those other implications that come out and then get shamed and demoralized. And okay, I'm getting. Ugh.
I knew as soon as I started talking, so I remember observing these things about a program of a past, facility, and I was like, "Can you make it make sense?" I was like, can anybody make this make sense? Like, and I know that it's a very, it's more as a macro level thing, but I don't want to understand. I'm like, can we fix this? Because we're creating more, I feel like it can cause more harm but I mean, it's good source, resources and treatment is helpful, but I feel like on the macro level, it is not the most effective way of viewing it as the disease that it is. I guess I'm going to stop talking because I can keep going.
And I'll kind of close with this kind of thought. Why do we treat a long-term illness with an acute care model?
Yes, I was like, that's what my brain immediately is like, can you make it make sense? This is a chronic, impact on the mind and the body, and it's not something that's just going to go away at the end of this 12-week program, or, and it's fascinating to me. So, yeah, I wish that so many programs could see that that change and make it more centered around the disease model. And I feel like another thing that comes to my head is so many other things in our society, I feel like, are centered around a disease model that are physical health related, but not mental health related. And as soon as something I feel like is tied to mental health, especially the stigmatized, disease of addiction, then it's viewed differently. So, somebody. Amanda, were you getting ready to say something? Okay. So, Chris, I could go on and on and on, but let's go to our next point about social recovery and addiction, and how society leans towards blaming the victim, viewing addiction as a choice, and that concept.
I mean, sure. This is just kind of an observation that I've noted just across time. When somebody relapses, how quick are we to point the finger? Why'd you do that? What happened? And my brain immediately goes back to, okay, well, what happened to this person emotionally? What happened to this person? What events happened? This is a symptom of what's underneath. But there's that guilt and shame that seems to be targeted towards the person, instead of trying to understand, why did that need for the use come back?
And I think, sorry, Chris.
No.
I know. It's so interesting to me because my brain immediately connected this episode to a couple episodes ago when we were talking to Ryan Allen, and he does mental health treatment with preschool age children. And it's the same exact, why are we focusing on the behavior and not the why underneath of it? It applies to parenting, or, teaching a child, developing child skills. And then if you apply it to this episode, it's instead of we're not getting to where we need to be in order to help that person if we're just going to focus on the behavior itself.
I almost going back to a cog skills type of approach of, when you look at the behavior, that's just the tip of the iceberg. You don't see the thoughts, the emotions, anything beneath it. And those are the areas we truly have to target, because the behavior is just what we see. I like to kind of equate it to the emotion of anger. We see anger, but anger tends to be a secondary emotion. So what's underneath that? Why are we projecting anger? Because we're scared, we're the fear, we hurt, whatever that emotion is.
And if somebody has just relapsed, their prefrontal cortex is not necessarily completely online. They're not thinking the most logically, right? They're going through, if you see them and now they've decided to stop using again, or they used once, and they relapsed a couple times and now they're not using. They're going through post-acute withdrawal, right? They're not thinking logically. And addiction is a disease of isolation, right? So it's come over here in this corner with me. Don't tell anyone about me, right? If you talk about me or anything like that, then I have to go away, and I'm the only thing that makes you feel comfortable, so don't talk about me. But now you have somebody that's why did you do that? Right? And trying to process all this stuff logically and cognitively, which is just instilling more guilt and shame and making you want to curl away into that little corner of addiction again. Yeah. And then the other thing that I thought of as Chris was talking is, I just remember I've worked with a lot of people. I do a lot of supervision. I've worked with people in detoxes and crisis centers, and there's this feeling, I don't know. And you hear it from other people oh, yep, there's a repeat person. Oh, yep, they're in here every week. Oh, yep, they're back again. Oh, they're, what's the word I'm looking for? whatever, they're just a repeat client and they're constantly in here. And it's like, why are we shaming them? What?
I would argue.
Frequent flyer, yeah. And I'm like, okay, that's not something like that's a moral failure of theirs and that we should just laugh off or make fun of or shame them for. What is going on that they can't stop?
And I agree. And while I would say that the type of behavior that you're noting, repeat offender or whatever, I'd throw that out the window. That's a manifestation of that individual's burnout or compassion fatigue or, it. But where I was going with that is that's that own individual's person, then they project blame, which then facilitates the guilt and shame of the person who's already struggling. And there was a comment I wanted to make about when you're making the comment about, we have to be in the corner, don't talk to anybody, don't, if you tell them about me, I have to go away. To my own knowledge, addiction is the only disease I know of that actively tries to tell you it's not a disease.
Because it's in your head.
Mm-hmm.
I see it happen, just not to that scale. So like I work with a lot of people with chronic illness and chronic pain. Mm-hmm. So I hear them have not so great interactions with medical professionals if they end up having to go back to the hospital or back to the doctor frequently because their symptoms are flaring. And you'll hear, I've worked in doctors' offices, and I've unfortunately heard them say, medical professionals say the not so kindest things about people that aren't, what do they call it? Like a diabetic patient, like a non-compliant, right? And I know we've heard non-compliant in the addiction or criminal justice world too, which just like, okay, are they actively choosing not to do this? Or is there an underlying fear, like you alluded to earlier? Is there some sort of mental block? Is there trauma? Is there lack of education, right? Like, why are we just going to hang this person and say, it's your fault, you're terrible, look at you showing up again, and perpetuating? Yeah, okay.
I feel like where I say I can't speak on, the experience of working with those that struggle with substance use. But what I see, so my perspective or things that I have seen that come to my mind here is those clients of mine that struggle with borderline personality disorder and self-harming or suicidal ideation. You might need to feel like a trigger warning or something on this one, but like the ones who, go and get hospitalized, to get stabilized and struggling with suicidality, and their perspective, the way they're being perceived, and then ultimately being treated by those hospital staff. Like I had a client recently be hospitalized. They voluntarily admitted themselves and came out and told me some of the things that those physicians had said to them. And I'm like, what? They were like, yeah, your brain was just lying to you. You didn't have to come in here for this. And I'm like, what? So it's all like Amanda, like you said, it's in your head. And and my brain also goes to, are they non-compliant, or is there things within this treatment system or their treatment team that they're not getting, and they don't feel safe. They don't know how to say, hey, I'm not getting what I need. I'm just going to keep going through the motions that everybody keeps telling me because I don't feel like I'm worth it anymore. But that addiction to those other behaviors I've seen and the way that they are treated makes total sense as well.
And I'm glad that you brought that up. I'm going to quote Gabor Mate again. If you wanted to design a system that would make addiction worse, you design a system that continues to shame, guilt, punish the person. And we have unfortunately done that for a long time, even among medical professionals. And as I want to go back to what you said, Kelsi, about medical professionals saying unkind things. At best, it's an insult, what they're saying. At best. I'm immediately thinking of all of the invalidation, all of the, oh, your problem's not real.
It's like I just got
gaslighting.
Gaslighting my doctor, like, but and I'm like, yeah, you did. That's yep.
You know, if it, I say this in jest, but it's almost like telling somebody who's struggling with depression, oh, just cheer up, you're okay.
Well, yeah, at best, it's an insult. At worst, you've triggered their trauma from childhood, right? Like, I see that so often, and how difficult, I was just having this discussion the other day with my nail girl, but like, how difficult is it to get the courage to just make the call, right? Not even mental health or addiction related. Some people, given their life circumstances, it can be insanely difficult to just make a call and decide I'm going to take care of myself in this way, right? Whether that's a specialist, a doctor, whatever. And then you have a really unhelpful conversation with the receptionist, or you go to your first appointment and it's not trauma informed. I think this is a good segue into our last point about what's the underlying root of addiction and the influence of like trauma and pain, but also what has come to mind as we've been talking that is often missed. And we wonder why people keep exhibiting symptoms of the disease or relapsing. What about the cultural considerations, right? Like, what piece of that person's culture are we not taking into account and therefore exacerbating the symptoms even worse?
Absolutely. And one thing that I'll add before we segue into the last portion is that, you know, I love that you brought up the courage to make that call, the courage to even say, hey, I think I need to talk to somebody about this. You know, because I don't think it's the intention, but we're taking people who are in a vulnerable space and then giving them negative interaction with like a treatment facility, or, you know, they have feelings of invalidation. And then, you know, I've even had individuals tell me I refuse to go back to X, Y, and Z place because of how I feel. And in fact, how I was treated there makes me really not even want to seek treatment to begin with.
Yeah, like when my client, confidentiality, so very, 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 very vaguely sent me a message, let me know that they were voluntarily, you know, admitting themselves. And, you know, my instantaneous response to them back was, I am so proud of you. And then they go and they have this experience. And then I'm like, I'm still proud of you, though.
I can think of a few that I'm having a similar conversation with right now, and it's painful to see that health professionals kind of even perpetuate it to a degree, whether or not it's intended or not. It's still the message being given.
Yes, absolutely. And when we touched on this, like the cultural consideration, my brain initially goes to like the more micro, like their family setting and the culture just about mental health and addiction or substance use that person is coming from. And then obviously we can get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that person's, you know, so many things, socioeconomic, race, ethnicity, all the things. But it's like this person we don't exist in a vacuum, and there's, you know, systems at play in culture. And just like, I mean, an example of like a cultural consideration just out in this rural area where I live is, you know, you don't acknowledge those things. Like when you said, like, it takes so much to step out and to say, like, this is a problem for me. It's not been considered a problem for anybody else, but in my life or in my culture. But for me, I can tell that this is a problem that I don't want in my life anymore. Like, I want to address this, you know, like in rural, you know, you go to work and you come home, you're entitled to have as many beers as you want at the end of a day, for example. And it just becomes something that's part of the culture.
Absolutely. That's a whole topic. We could run out the clock on just that topic alone. I know Amanda and I were talking earlier, and I was like, it was very hard to boil it down to 3 points, bullet points, because there's so many different ways to look at this. This is just a brief overview, at best.
What are some, I think we've touched a lot on like, what is the root, what is, what's under there, the trauma, anything else you want to say on that, but then also like, what are some of the cultural considerations you feel like need to be taken into account in working with addiction, or you personally focus on? And the other thing that's also coming into play is religion, because that's always a beautiful point of sometimes trauma too, or discrepancy between whether I'm going to go get the help or not.
Mm-hmm. So to go to the root of addiction, it's so vast, I don't have a good answer. Like when I sit down with an individual, I ask them, what purpose did this serve? Well, I feel alone. And then I'll go, well, how long have you been feeling alone? When is the first time you can remember this feeling that you started to cope by using substances? And a lot of the time it'll be somewhere in childhood. Let's say, I'm just hypothetically here, a sibling who had a child who had a sibling who required a lot of attention due to medical concerns. And then they grew up with the message that I'm not cared for as much as so-and-so. I am less wanted. I am less valuable. And it starts negatively impacting their self-esteem and their image, self-worth, and then they feel abysmal about themselves, so they start using to kind of medicate that. The root of the addiction is their self-worth. It's more of building on that area, the message they're getting. The substances that are causing their own problems in and of their own right, but to look at a primary condition would be that how they view themselves.
And I feel like the word that my eye focused on and like related instantly to what you were saying is pain.
Yeah.
I feel like that, whether that's physical, you see it for physical pain, medicating for physical pain, you see it emotional pain. I feel like that's a theme that's kind of developing here, is a root of some kind of pain.
And there is nothing wrong with not wanting to be in pain.
Nobody ever taught you how to manage it. So of course, the first time you took a sip, or the first time you hit that blunt, or the first time you cut, or the first time you had sex, even, because we see that with sexual promiscuity too. Of course you were like, whoa, hey, this is kind of nice. I don't have to feel that anymore. And the other thing I thought about, Chris, is that we know that there's the root of some sort of trauma or unmet need or attachment, but I think oftentimes people have a very hard time identifying it for all the factors, right? It's been so long. They've used this other coping mechanism for so long that it's had its own consequences, all the things. But yet, I think oftentimes we'll ask people, right? Like when we assess or throughout our treatment process with them, like, has anything ever traumatic happened to you? Do you identify anything in your life as trauma? And they'll just swear up and down no. And you're like, but there's something we're missing, right? And it's not their fault. I think the key here is, ever since I've heard it, I've just latched onto it because it felt so validating for me personally, but also for others, is trauma isn't just what happened to you. It can also be what didn't happen, right? Like what you didn't get. And I think that in America specifically, we might see that as selfish, to say, oh, it's okay that I wanted to be seen and acknowledged by my parent. No, that's okay. Like, I didn't really need that. And you can kind of rationalize why that wasn't traumatic.
Well, look at the example I gave you about the sibling with the child with a sibling who had a lot of medical concerns. It was the lack of what they got. It wasn't something overt happening to them. It was they did not get the attention growing up because they had a sibling who required medical attention. Now, I'm quite sure, in this situation that it wasn't implicitly like, oh, we're going to deny you the emotions. It was more, hey, this person actually just needs the help because of what's going on. But the way it manifests inside is that I'm not worthy of connection, or I'm not worthy of your love or your attachment. And unfortunately, that can stick with us lifelong.
I think that's a big hiccup I see with people too, is that they think not only does that make me selfish, but if I bring that up and I make that a problem, then I'm saying that my parent wasn't a good parent. And that's not the case. We're not saying they're a horrible person. They were probably doing the best they could with what they had at the time, right? Not knowing all the factors to the story. But your needs were still your needs, and those are basic needs. Those aren't just like willy-nilly, like, soft things out there. Those are basic human needs, especially with a primary caregiver.
Mm-hmm. And if we feel that our needs aren't met, we will turn to something that makes them feel met. And I want to kind of circle back because I know we scrolled for a moment, but you talked about the cultural piece. There's a lot that can be said of the cultural element, and I don't even really know where to start because I'm trying to think of individuals that I've worked with, and it's usually more about exploring what their environment is like. I'll quote Bruce Alexander's Rat Park. If that cage is empty, and you only have the option between using the water or the substance water, what are you going to do, right? But what is the culture inside that cage?
What is this person immersed, like, because
Mm-hmm.
what are they immersed in? I have so many thoughts. I'm trying to organize them. They're immersed in this every day, but then, like, perspective, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
my perspective is my reality. So getting that person, I have to gather, I'm treating a human being that's coming from so many different systems and cultural expectations and like norms and so many things that are at play here, which again, I know we're towards the end, so we can't go into all of that, but it's like, I'm literally plucking somebody that we're plucking them out. They're in my office with me and we're trying to talk about it. But if their perspective is their reality, we have to it takes, time to really get a good grasp on. And like I said earlier, we don't exist in a vacuum, and it can be very difficult because that person, they're with us and we're learning these things about them. And then a lot of times they go back to that environment and are back immersed into that again. So it's a lot more. I think I say all of that to say that this all these considerations have so much more power than what I think people really think that they do. It's like,
absolutely
makes up, a whole person. It doesn't mean that these things can't be changed or they can't have, some more control. We just have to figure out what that looks like.
And I opened up with I didn't really have a good answer because it's looking at there's so much, it's so vast that if I were to try to conceptualize it into just a tiny neat bullet points, I'm gonna do everybody a disservice. Let's just be upfront. But I have one individual in my head that I'm just thinking of, and this was many years ago, and they were basically, I hit a certain age. I was basically told you start selling drugs, you go to jail, and then you're a man. And my mind keeps coming back, well, how long have you been getting these these messages, and where did those stem from? So you're not a man if you're not selling substances or you haven't been to jail. Now that's getting into a completely different area, but that's the culture of it.
I think it also goes back to at the beginning when we were talking about the lack of wraparound services. we can do all these things in a vacuum in treatment or in a bubble in treatment, but what am I sending you back to? Like we said, are we offering recovery housing, or are we making sure that you have those support services to help step you back where you originally came from? Because it's not going to be easy to just drastically change everything about your environment. We know if you've been actively using substances the majority of your life, you likely probably haven't been able to build much of a resume or have much education to fall back on or certifications. You probably have broken bridges with all of your support systems. So we're just like, okay, you're healed. Good luck.
Kind of like what I mentioned, treating a long-term illness with a disease with an acute care model.
So interesting. Everything comes full circle. We go to a totally different bullet point and we're like, aha, yep. Well, there's again.
As I was telling, like I said before the podcast, I was telling Amanda, I have like 4,000 different topics. We can only pick 3 or 4. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so many, like just the cultural, I guess, examples for our listeners, different things that are going through my head of different cultural considerations as we kind of process this out more before we wrap up. Was so we have, is there violence in the house? Am I coming from a household of addicts? Is there a culture of crime? Is there a culture of, I'm not safe anywhere, because of my race or whatever? Like, the poverty, like things that go through my head now as we're talking, like we've said, we don't have time to get into those, but there's a lot there. Like that'd be a really good, I think, another episode or something if you want to come back, Chris.
Yeah, I would love to.
Yeah, that's a whole person and environment approach, right? We can't just treat you as 1 hour a week sitting in my office. And I know, substance use treatment is usually more often than that, especially if, they need a higher level of care in the beginning. But for like mental health outpatient, even if I see you once a week, that's like a blip compared to the rest of the life you're living out there and all the systemic issues, familial issues. Yeah, that could definitely be a whole nother episode in itself.
Yeah, and we didn't even touch base anywhere on the criminal justice system's response. That's an episode in and of itself. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think we should do it because I can feel myself being fired up about it. Like, and I just can like go on and on and on. And I was like, okay, now's not the time. We're out of time. But yeah, we should talk more. And I think that'd be a good build off topic for another episode for sure. So wrapping up, Chris, we ask every guest if they have any mantra, any sayings, anything that's ever stuck with you over the course of not just your career, but your life, anything that you would like to leave our community with as we wrap up before we do kind of our outro process.
Well, first, thank you for having me. And you kind of hit me with a deep philosophical question at the end. Nah, I tend to have the mantra, you don't punish the person for showing symptoms of why they're here. The more we guilt, the more we shame, the more we go, no, all we're doing is really ingraining that, well, why did I come seek help? We want to welcome them. We want to, okay, well, why is this happening? So my mantra is just that unconditional positive regard, that meet them where they're at, whether or not, and maybe we'll get back into this in the next episode, let's say they're court ordered. I'm going to meet you where you're at right here, right now, because at the end of the day, what you wanted 3 months ago may be different than what you want at the end.
I think that's huge too, Chris, and I appreciate you saying that because it just makes me think, like, for those that aren't necessarily like professionals that are listening, just to have that grace and compassion for other people. If you told your friends you were really struggling with eating a healthy diet or whatever the changes you're trying to make or the thing that's super vulnerable for you to communicate, and you finally do, what would you want that to be met with? Right? Like you want to be seen as a person, you want to be loved unconditionally, you want that compassion, because otherwise it's just going to make you curl back up into yourself and what feels comfortable and safe, which is the unhelpful coping that we're trying to stop. So I just wanted to leave that little segue there. Chris, thank you so much for being here. Chris has been a colleague for many years now, and it's really beautiful to have 3 social workers all together on the podcast. I'm not sure when you'll come back, but potentially in a couple weeks here, we might not do the Man Down podcast because it's on my due date. So if Chris is able to on the 29th, that might be a good filler since it's like consistent back to back. If we need you, maybe that'll happen.
Yeah, we can definitely talk. We can definitely figure that out.
So thank you everyone for listening. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe. If you subscribe, you'll get notifications on when all the latest episodes are coming up. Please give us feedback and rate us and let us know what you want to hear from us in the future. Bye everyone.
Bye everyone. Take care.
Take care.